Welcome to the Hard Questions, Real Answers podcast. Today, I am here with special guest, author, and associate professor of leadership formation at Fuller Seminary, Tod Bolsinger. Tod, as we wrap up our little series on leadership and on your book, Canoeing the Mountains, we want to talk about transformation. You talk a lot about transformation and that process. And I believe that, and I think you do too, that leadership should be transformational. It should happen to those that you lead, but it also needs to happen to you as a leader. And I think transformation, at least I would say positive transformation, won't happen by accident. So how can people facilitate and create leadership transformation?
Well, the first thing is that you, as a transformation happens to everybody in the leadership process, and it starts with a leader. So the first thing is you got to recognize no one is going to be more transformed than you as the leader. If you got into this to get other people to do what you want them to do, you're not leading, you're being a bully. You're like, that's not the same thing. Leadership is about transformation. And the way that that happens is, I believe, is through reflection, relationships, and spiritual practices. It's a process of formation. And in my most recent book, I've been talking about the transformation needed to be resilient in the face of resistance. And it's a formation process. It's not just about gritting your teeth and gutting it out. It's about actually going through a process of becoming both stronger and wiser through a process of transformation.
Okay, so give us those three again. Reflection,
relationships, and a rule of life, a set of spiritual practices. Many of us have spiritual practices that are focused on our discipleship, but not spiritual practices intentionally to help us be better leaders. And one of the things I often encourage leaders to do is to revisit their spiritual practices and ask them, what are the qualities you need to have in your life? And what are the spiritual practices that you need to be able to practice so those qualities go into your life?
Well, let's just talk about that for a second. What are those spiritual practices that we should be focusing on? Because here, back to the Bible, actually, we talk a lot about spiritual formation, and we would just say maybe spiritual fitness, the things we need to do become everything God called us to be. So unpack that a little bit more for us.
Well, so the easiest way for me to say this is when I first became a Christian, people told me, if you want to follow Jesus, you got to know him. And you got to know him by reading the Bible every day and praying every day and going to church every week. I still do that. But then when I became a preaching pastor, I needed to do more than read the Bible every day. I needed to do hours of deep study. And now I work with pastors leading change. And mostly what they need is wisdom and strength to lead people who are resistant. And so I have a set of spiritual practices in my new book, Tempered Resilience, that are around learning and listening and looking and lamenting. And they're a different kind of spiritual practice than most of us have thought of in the past, but they actually come right out of the history of the scriptures and Christian tradition, where we learn to be people who are humble and teachable and attuned and empathic and adaptable and wise and tenacious and resilient, because we have learned to see the pain points of the world and the injustice of the world and to take them to Jesus first.
I think that could be part of the reason why reflection, that first practice you mentioned, might be so hard, because to reflect means to actually go back and evaluate and to possibly relive some of those painful pieces of the day or of the week. One of the things that we do as a family, I've got 3 small boys, but we go through this kind of five-part ritual at night. You know, we read a book, we read the Bible, we pray, we sing, but then the last part is reflection. We talk about, today, what went well, what didn't go well, what could you have done better? It's not to bring up the sins of the past, but just a way to, again, evaluate and improve on the day. So is that what you're talking about in reflection? Just unpack that a little bit more before we close out our time.
Well, 2 things. One is what you just described, and looking back at the day, is what the Jesuits, the Catholic tradition, would call the prayer of examen. It's a prayer where literally every day in gratitude, you look back at your day and you ask the Lord, where did I see you and respond in joy to your presence? And where did I miss you, or because I was absorbed in my own things? Where are my consolations? What are my desolations? We taught our children growing up that exact same prayer. And what that reflection does, it's not to make us guilty, it's to make us vulnerable. It's to make us open to God's Spirit shaping us. And what leaders need in reflection is to be able to embrace how vulnerable it feels to be be a leader who is needing to learn, and oftentimes learn in front of people, and be willing to let your vulnerability be part of how God shapes you into the tool that you need to be.
Wow. I couldn't agree more. I think the most teachable moments with a congregation, at least in my experience, is when I've been open enough and vulnerable enough to talk about my own failures, my faults, and just who I am. People stop looking at you as some high and mighty authority, but rather just as a person who sincerely cares and wants to help grow people, but also want to grow in the process. Tod, I can't thank you enough for your time. If people want to learn more about your book, Canoeing the Mountains, or your new book, where should they go?
Well, here's an easy thing my team set up. If you just text the word change, C-H-A-N-G-E, to 66866, it'll get you connected to the Church Leadership Initiative, and that's where we have our books and our resources and the things we offer. Change 66866.
That is awesome. I highly encourage our listeners and those watching today, you got to check out Tod's books, his literature. It really will change the way you view leadership and how you lead. You won't just be leading people, but instead you'll be transforming yourself and the lives of others. Tod, thank you so much for your time over the last few weeks.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the Hard Questions, Real Answers podcast. To learn more about our podcast, be sure you check out backtothebible.org. Also, if you enjoy our program, be sure to give us a rating and share us if you like us on your favorite podcasting app. Remember, ask the hard questions and only accept real answers.
Was the resurrection of Jesus real, or just another myth like Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster? Pastor Nat Crawford helps you find the answer to these questions in his new ebook, Why Easter Changes Everything.
Join me on a journey that looks closely at the skeptics, the possibilities, and the evidence of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. Let's look closely at the difference Jesus makes as we explore the simplicity and the power of gospel truths in your life today.
Why Easter Changes Everything. Download your free e-copy today.